In August 1943, a young Navy lieutenant named John F. Kennedy found himself clinging to a piece of wreckage in the dark waters of the Solomon Islands. His PT boat, PT-109, had been cut in half by a Japanese destroyer. Two of his crew were dead, and the rest were scattered across the oil-slicked sea. Kennedy would survive, of course, becoming a war hero and eventually the 35th President of the United States. But PT-109 is just one boat, one story, one moment in a war that saw hundreds of these small, fast wooden vessels deployed across the Pacific and beyond. Here's what most people don't know. Of the 531 PT boats built during World War II, many simply vanished. Not destroyed in spectacular battles, not scuttled when the war ended. They just disappeared, vanished from official records, lost to history. Some went down in combat, yes, but others, their fates remain mysteries even 80 years later. Tonight, I want to take you into the shadowy world of PT boat operations, a world of night raids, covert missions, and desperate battles in the darkest corners of the Pacific. We'll explore not just the famous stories, but the unknown ones, the boats that left port and never returned, the crews that radioed for help and were never heard from again, the missions so classified that even today, we don't know exactly what happened. This is the story of the devil boats, as the Japanese called them, and the mysteries they left behind. Before we dive into the mysteries, we need to understand what these vessels were and why they captured the imagination of a generation. PT stands for Patrol Torpedo Boat, but that dry designation hardly captures what these craft really were. Imagine a vessel about 80 feet long, roughly the length of a modern tennis court, powered by three massive aircraft engines producing over 4,000 horsepower. These boats could reach speeds of 40 knots or more, making them some of the fastest warships ever built. But here's the thing, they were made almost entirely of wood, plywood to be precise. In an age of steel battleships and armored cruisers, PT boats were constructed from two layers of mahogany planking with waterproof glue in between. They were cramped, uncomfortable, and structurally fragile. A single shell from a destroyer could blow one to splinters, yet they packed a serious punch. 4 torpedo tubes carrying Mark 8 torpedoes, the same weapons used by submarines, multiple machine guns, including .50 caliber Brownings, depth charges. Later models even carried rockets and small cannons. For their size, they were among the most heavily armed vessels in the Navy. The crews were volunteers, usually young officers and enlisted men who wanted action. These weren't the massive cruisers of battleships or carriers. A PT boat typically had a crew of just 12 to 14 men. Everyone knew everyone. It was intimate warfare, personal in a way that service on a large ship could never be. The PT boat's mission was equally unique. They operated at night, using their speed and small size to dart in close to enemy positions, launch torpedoes, and disappear before the enemy could respond. They harassed Japanese supply lines, rescued downed pilots, conducted covert insertions of special operations forces, and fought desperate battles in narrow straits and shallow waters where larger ships couldn't go. They were expendable assets conducting dangerous missions in hostile waters, which brings us to our central mystery. When one didn't come back, how hard did anyone really look for it? Let's start with the most famous PT boat loss because it illuminates how many others were lost in similar circumstances. August 2nd, 1943. The Blackett Strait near the Solomon Islands. 15 PT boats are on patrol hunting for the Tokyo Express. Japanese destroyer runs bringing supplies to their isolated garrisons. It's a moonless night, pitch black, the kind of darkness where you literally cannot see your hand in front of your face. PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant Kennedy, is patrolling alone. The boats had become separated. Suddenly, out of the darkness, a massive shape appears, the Japanese destroyer, Amagiri, traveling at high speed. There's no time to react. The destroyer's bow slices PT-109 in half. 2 crew members are killed instantly. The stern section sinks immediately. Kennedy and 10 survivors cling to the floating bow section covered in flaming gasoline. We know this story because Kennedy and his men survived. They spent 5 days on a tiny island before being rescued by local coast watchers. Kennedy became a hero. PT-109 became a legend. But here's what's rarely discussed. PT-109 wasn't the only boat lost in the Blackett Strait that night. PT-123 was also sunk by the same Japanese destroyer force. 3 men died. The survivors were rescued, but the boat was gone. And PT-109 wasn't even the first PT boat lost in those waters. 2 weeks earlier, on July 20th, PT-117 had been destroyed in a surface action, blown to pieces by Japanese fire. 4 men killed. Then came PT-109 and PT-123 on August 2nd. Then, just 4 days later, on August 6th, PT-112 was destroyed by Japanese aircraft. 1 killed, several wounded. 4 PT boats lost in less than 3 weeks, all in the same general area. The Blackett Strait was becoming a graveyard, but we only remember one of them. Why? Because Kennedy survived and went on to become president. The others, their crews died or faded into obscurity. Their stories weren't told. Even today, if you ask most Americans about PT boats in World War II, they'll mention PT-109 and nothing else. This pattern repeats throughout the war. Some losses became famous, most were forgotten, and some boats simply vanished without anyone knowing exactly what happened. Take PT-323, lost in the Mediterranean in April 1944. She was on a routine patrol off the Italian coast and simply never returned. No distress call, no wreckage found, no survivors. To this day, nobody knows for certain what happened. Mine, torpedo, mechanical failure that caused her to sink before the crew could radio for help? We don't know. Or PT-371, which disappeared in the Adriatic Sea in January 1945, gone. No trace, 11 men lost. The official record simply says missing in action. These weren't ships with crews of thousands where the loss would trigger major investigations. These were small boats with small crews, and in the chaos of war, they sometimes slipped through the cracks of history. If you want to understand where PT boats were truly tested and where many met mysterious ends, you need to look at the Philippines campaign. In December 1941, when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, the U.S. had 6 PT boats based there. Motor Torpedo, Boat Squadron 3. These boats, under the command of Lieutenant John Bulkley, conducted some of the most daring operations of the early war. They harassed Japanese invasion forces, raided enemy positions, and most famously evacuated General Douglas MacArthur from Corregidor to Mindanao in March 1942. Bulkley became a hero, awarded the Medal of Honor, but of those original 6 boats, only 1 survived the Philippines campaign. PT-32 was destroyed by Japanese aircraft on January 19, 1942. PT-33 was scuttled after being damaged beyond repair in February. PT-34 was sunk by enemy fire in April, just before the fall of Bataan. PT-35 ran aground and was destroyed by her crew to prevent capture. PT-41, the boat that carried MacArthur, was later scuttled when she could no longer be maintained. Only PT-31 made it out, barely, evacuated to Australia. But here's where it gets mysterious. When the U.S. returned to the Philippines in 1944-45, they brought dozens of PT boats with them, and these boats fought in some of the strangest, most confusing battles of the war. The Philippines is an archipelago, over 7,000 islands with thousands of narrow channels, shallow bays, and hidden coves. It was perfect PT boat country, but it was also perfect ambush country. Japanese forces, cut off and desperate, used everything they had. Coastal guns, suicide boats, swimmers with explosives strapped to bamboo poles. PT-493 was lost in Ormoc Bay in December 1944. She was supporting the landing at Ormoc when Japanese aircraft attacked. A bomb struck near the boat, and she was abandoned and sank. But here's the strange part. The official records disagree about exactly what happened. Some accounts say she was hit directly. Others say she was damaged by near misses and flooding. The crew survivors gave conflicting accounts. To this day, the exact sequence of events is unclear. Even stranger is the case of PT-77. On the night of December 11th, 1944, she was operating off Leyte when she simply disappeared. No distress call, no explosion witnessed. She just vanished. Search operations found nothing. As months later, wreckage washed ashore on a beach identified as belonging to PT-77. But it was impossible to determine how she'd been destroyed. Was it a mine? A submarine? Collision with an uncharted reef? Mechanical failure? Or something else entirely? We'll never know. The Philippines campaign saw PT boats used in ways they were never designed for. Daylight operations, prolonged engagements, close support of amphibious landings. The losses mounted. Some were well documented. Others left only questions. Consider this. Between December 1944 and March 1945, at least 15 PT boats were lost or damaged beyond repair in Philippine waters. That's more than 10% of the entire PT boat force deployed there. Some were definitely destroyed by enemy action, aircraft, coastal guns, suicide boats. But others, the records are incomplete, contradictory, or simply missing. Part of the problem was the nature of PT boat operations. They operated at night, often alone or in small groups in hostile waters. If a boat went down quickly, from a mine, a lucky shell to the engine room, or a catastrophic explosion, there might be no survivors to report what happened. If there were survivors, they were often picked up by other PT boats hours later, exhausted and traumatized. Their accounts fragmented and confused, and in the chaos of a major campaign with hundreds of ships operating, thousands of men dying, and battles raging across dozens of islands, a small wooden boat with a crew of 12 wasn't always a high priority for investigation. Now we enter even murkier territory, the PT boats that disappeared while on classified missions. Not all PT boat operations were straightforward combat patrols. Some were intelligence gathering, some supported resistance fighters behind enemy lines, some conducted covert insertions of OSS operatives, the forerunners of the CIA, and some missions remain classified even today, 80 years after the war ended. Here's what we know. PT boats regularly worked with Allied intelligence operations throughout the Pacific. They had the speed to get in and out quickly, the shallow draft to navigate coastal waters, and the small size to avoid detection. They were perfect for covert work. In the Philippines, PT boats worked extensively with Filipino guerrilla forces. They would slip into remote coves at night, offload supplies and weapons, pick up intelligence officers or downed pilots, and disappear before dawn. These missions were rarely documented in detail. Operational security demanded silence. But what happened when one of these missions went wrong? There are documented cases where PT boats on covert missions simply failed to return. The official records would note lost in action or presumed sunk, but with few details. Was it because the details were classified or because nobody survived to tell what happened? PT-3 WWII is a fascinating case. She was operating in the Adriatic Sea, supporting Yugoslav partisans and conducting intelligence missions along the Dalmatian coast. In August 1944, she was reported as missing after a mission. For weeks, she was presumed lost with all hands. Then, a month later, the crew turned up alive. They'd been on a covert mission, been hit by German coastal fire, beached the boat, and escaped inland with partisan help. For operational security reasons, they couldn't break radio silence. For a month, they were officially dead men walking. It makes you wonder how many other lost PT boats might have met similar fates. How many crews might have survived initially, only to die in jungle or behind enemy lines, their stories never recorded. There's another dimension to this. Some PT boats were modified for special operations, equipped with extra radios, unusual weapons, or specialized equipment. These boats conducted missions that weren't part of the standard combat record, and when they were lost, the circumstances were often classified. After the war, as records were declassified, some mysteries were solved, others only deepened. There are still PT boat losses listed in naval records with notations like circumstances classified or full details restricted. What were these boats doing? Who were they carrying? Where exactly did they go down? We may never know. The greatest mystery of the PT boats isn't what happened during the war, it's what happened after. When World War II ended in August 1945, the United States had hundreds of PT boats scattered across the Pacific, the Mediterranean, and even Alaska. These boats had served with distinction. They'd sunk enemy ships, rescued downed pilots, supported amphibious landings, and fought desperate battles in the most hostile waters on Earth. So what happened to them? Most were simply destroyed, burned, scuttled, cut up for scrap. It sounds wasteful, even barbaric, but there was a cold logic to it. PT boats were expensive to transport back to the United States. They couldn't make the voyage under their own power. They were made of wood, which deteriorates rapidly in tropical climates. They required constant maintenance, and with the war over, the Navy had no use for hundreds of patrol boats, so they were disposed of, sometimes ceremonially, towed out to sea and used for target practice, sometimes efficiently, hauled onto beaches and set ablaze, sometimes ignominiously, left to rot in tropical harbors. Here's the stunning statistic. Of the 531 PT boats built during World War II, only about a dozen survive today. A dozen out of more than 500. But here's where it gets mysterious. We don't actually know what happened to many of them. The disposal records are incomplete. Some boats were transferred to allied nations, the Philippines, South Korea, Norway. Some were sold as surplus to private buyers. Some were simply abandoned in remote harbors and forgotten. Take PT-728, for example. She was stationed in the Philippines when the war ended. Official records show she was disposed of in 1946, but there is no record of how or where. She just disappears from the records. Is she at the bottom of Manila Bay? Was she scrapped, given to the Philippine Navy? Nobody knows. Or PT-565, which was operating in Alaska. She was supposedly decommissioned and disposed of in 1946, but there is no disposal record. For years, there were rumors that she'd been sold to a fishing company and converted to a civilian vessel. Other rumors said she sank in a storm off the Aleutians. The truth? Unknown. The most intriguing cases involve boats that were sold as war surplus to private buyers. These boats would be stripped of weapons and military equipment, then sold for as little as $1,000, roughly $17,000 in today's money. Some buyers wanted them for commercial fishing, others for pleasure cruising, a few for smuggling, though that wasn't advertised. These civilian PT boats would operate for a few years, change hands, maybe change names, and then vanish from records. So there are persistent stories of ex-PT boats operating as rum runners in the Caribbean during the 1950s. Others allegedly smuggled refugees out of Cuba after Castro took power. One supposedly ended up as a casino boat in the Philippines. How many are still out there rotting in forgotten boatyards, sunk in remote harbors, or disguised beyond recognition? We don't know. And in the 1960s, when PT-109 fever gripped America following Kennedy's presidency, people started looking for surviving PT boats. A few were found, lovingly restored, and placed in museums, but many more were lost to time. There's a particularly haunting story from 2010. A diver in the Solomon Islands discovered a wrecked PT boat in about 90 feet of water. It was intact, ghostly, covered in coral. The torpedo tubes were still mounted, the guns were gone, stripped by salvagers decades earlier, but the hull was there, recognizable, a wooden ghost from another era. Was it PT-109, PT-123, PT-117, PT-112, one of the other boats lost in those waters? They couldn't definitively identify it. The brass identification plates were missing. The hull numbers had long since faded. It was just one more mystery, one more ghost from the war. Behind every missing PT boat is a crew. Young men, most in their late teens or early 20s, who volunteered for one of the most dangerous assignments in the Navy. The casualty statistics for PT boat crews were sobering. Approximately 3,000 men served on PT boats during World War II. Of those, about 200 were killed in action, another 100 were wounded, and dozens more were listed as missing in action. That's nearly a 10% casualty rate, higher than many other naval assignments. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Let me share a few. Seaman, second class, Harold Marney, and torpedoman. Second class, Andrew Jackson Kirksey were the two men killed when PT-109 was rammed. Marney was from Massachusetts, 19 years old. Kirksey was from Georgia, 25. They died instantly when the destroyer's bow crushed the forward section of the boat. Their bodies were never recovered. For years, their families held out hope they'd somehow survived, were prisoners, would come home. They never did. Or consider the crew of PT-323, the boat that vanished in the Mediterranean. 13 men. We know their names. Lieutenant Ralph Richards, the commander, was 24. Ensign James Newbury, 22nd. Motor machinist, mate Frank Davis, 21st. And 10 others, all young, all volunteers, all simply gone. Their families received telegrams. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you, but there was no closure, no wreckage found, no bodies recovered, no detailed explanation of what happened, just missing in action, and later, when enough time had passed, presumed dead. These families lived with uncertainty for years, sometimes decades. Some never gave up hope. There are documented cases of mothers who, into the 1960s and 70s, still believed their sons might come home, might have amnesia, might have been prisoners who escaped. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was immense. And then there are the survivors who carry their own mysteries. The men who lived through PT boat losses but could never quite explain what happened. Traumatic memories are fragmented, unreliable. Men who were in the water, surrounded by darkness and fire, who saw their boat explode but couldn't say exactly what hit it. Who survived but lost. Brothers in arms, whose final moments remain unknown. John F. Kennedy carried the weight of PT-109 for the rest of his life. He never forgot the two men who died. He never forgot the desperate nights in the Solomon Islands. When he became president, he kept a coconut shell on his desk in the Oval Office, the shell he'd carved a rescue message on during those 5 days after PT-109 sank. It was a reminder of mortality, of luck, of the randomness of survival. For every famous survivor like Kennedy, there were dozens of others who came home, tried to rebuild their lives, and lived with memories they couldn't quite process. Some thrived, others struggled. All carried stories that often died with them. There's a bitter irony here. We've lost most of the boats, scrapped, scuttled, vanished. We've lost most of the veterans. World War II, veterans are now in their late 90s or beyond, and fewer survive each year. And we've lost many of the stories, operations that were never properly documented, losses that were never fully investigated, mysteries that were never solved. The ghosts of the PT boats are fading, slipping away into history. So what do we make of the mystery of the missing PT boats? Part of it is the nature of war. Records are incomplete. Things happen fast. People die. Priorities shift. In the chaos of global conflict, small boats and small crews can be overlooked, their stories lost. Part of it is the nature of classification. Some operations were secret then and remain partially classified now. We may never know the full truth about certain missions. Part of it is simple time. 80 years have passed. People forget. Records deteriorate. Wreckage corrodes. The ocean keeps its secrets. But I think there's something else too. The PT boats operated in the shadows, literally and figuratively. They fought at night. They conducted covert missions. They operated in remote, hostile waters far from witnesses and historians. They were expendable assets doing dangerous work in places where, if they disappeared, sometimes nobody could investigate, and sometimes nobody even knew exactly where to look. These boats and their crews deserve to be remembered, even, especially, when their stories are incomplete. The mysteries shouldn't diminish their service. If anything, the unanswered questions remind us of the fog of war, the uncertainty of combat, the reality that not every story has a neat conclusion. Today, a handful of PT boats survive in museums. You can visit them, walk their decks, and imagine what it was like to race through tropical nights hunting the enemy. They're beautiful machines, lovingly restored, peaceful now, but out in the Pacific, in the Mediterranean, in waters around the Philippines and the Solomons and a dozen other places, lie the others. The ones that didn't come home, the ones that vanished, the ones whose crews are still officially listed as missing in action. They are out there still, wooden ghosts beneath the waves, slowly dissolving into sand and coral, their stories lost, their crews remembered only by aging monuments and fading photographs. The mystery of the missing PT boats isn't just about missing vessels, it's about missing men, missing stories, missing chapters of history that we'll never fully recover. But as long as we keep asking the questions, as long as we remember that these boats and these crews existed, fought, and sometimes vanished into mystery, then in some small way they haven't been completely lost. Thank you.